The Saltash Empire was what you'd typically expect from a major interstellar empire. Physically imposing, with scales, teeth and claws, but smart enough to have developed quickly, and when they reached out into the great void of interstellar travel, it didn't take them long to demand a place in the intergalactic community. Unlike many species, they were never a comfortable fit, but were powerful enough that no one was quite willing to tell them no. Until the Terrans, at least. I am unsure why the war started. The original transcripts have been lost. I know that the human research outpost at Karnak 7 was destroyed by a Saltash Omavi, what the Terrans called a battle group. The research station was undefended, relying on the local fleet belonging to the Karnoth to defend it, and they were unequal to the task. The Terrans demanded reparations from the Union Council, but the Saltash ambassador used the threat of their might to deny the vote. Even with the Terran ambassador pointing out that if the other delegates stood united, they had enough firepower and political power to, as the humans put it, tell the snakes to pound sand. It was little surprise that the Terrans withdrew from the council prepared for war. The rest of us knew they couldn't win. The Saltash had the largest fleet, the most soldiers, and truly horrific weapons. Humanity was going to lose. Humanity, however, felt differently. The war lasted decades. The Saltash would appear at a human colony world, and the sky would be filled with blazing colours, as Saltash plasma weapons were matched by human railguns. Shields and armour, tactical manoeuvring, fighter wings and fleet tactics. Eventually, though, the superior numbers would force the Terrans to concede the planet, and an occupation would be established. And then the humans would appear again out of the jump points, with more ships and men and women ready to die for a world they'd already lost. Oleg Chernov, their military commander and space marshal of the Terran fleet, broadcast an address that was picked up and repeated many times, urging every human to take up a gun, every man, woman and child to fight, to stand against the Saltash on the plains of Elysium and the spaceports of Rokonarum. To fight, no matter the cost, and draw a line in the sand and blood. They fought, and died, and fell back, and still they fought. And those of us who in our shame did nothing began to notice something unusual as the war went on. There were fewer and fewer Saltash ships in the rest of the galaxy, and those that were almost always appeared older, poorly maintained and crewed by either the very young or very old. Still, humanity was pushed back, out of its colony worlds, all the way back to a tiny star system on the western spiral arm of the galaxy. Their home system, the last line in the sand. Every human had retreated behind the massive system defences, with enough remote weapons, orbital battle stations, and sensor buoys that one could practically walk across them. Nearly 50 years to the day since the war had started, the Saltash Armada slammed into the Sol system like a tidal wave, and broke on humanity's defences. Then the second Saltash Armada did the same, and then the third. Each one penetrated deeper into Sol. Entire planets were glassed, space stations destroyed, and humans put to the flame. And still they fought. I said all humans had retreated to Sol. That wasn't entirely true. A few had been offered, or purchased, safe haven, amongst other species. And as the twilight of their race came, I asked one that was staying on my world why his people had never offered surrender. The Saltash were brutal, but had a sense of honour, and while the penalties would be harsh, their species would survive. The human had barked at me. They called it their version of laughter, and told me that there was a mindset of humanity, that it was better to die fighting on your feet than to live as a slave. That humanity had enslaved itself, off and on throughout much of its history, and that it always rose in rebellion. That the end of slave rebellions would have inspired the Saltash to put them down anyway, and this way they could go out on their terms. To this day I do not understand it, but they had the right to make that determination for themselves. By now, there was not a Saltash ship to be seen outside of the Sol system. Broken ships by the tens of thousands filled the system with debris, and billions, trillions lay dead in the vacuum of space. Neutral observers went to see the final days of mankind, as the Fifth Fleet of Saltash, its final armada, and headed by the ruling council of Saltash, came to watch the Earth burn. The Fourth Fleet had broken humanity's final blockade, and nothing they had left could defeat another armada. The fleet battered its way through the final defences, and began the bombardment of the home of humanity, as a few battered and bedraggled ships fled solward. The last survivors of what had once been a promising young stellar empire. Whole continents were turned to radioactive slag, as the Saltash had long since given up on trying to conquer humanity, and simply wanted them dead. Fire rained through the atmosphere, burning the very air and ripping it off the planet. And when the bombardment stopped, and not a single living thing existed on Earth, its very oceans having been boiled off, and the crust itself cracked and bleeding magma, a signal was received by both the observers and the Saltash. A signal from a small platform in very close orbit to their star. My name is Space Marshal Oleg Chernov, Terran Confederation Navy, communicating in the clear to the Saltash Empire and to all neutral parties. This war started with your pointless attack against our research facility and will end with the destruction of Earth. Humanity was attacked unprovoked, and our allies abandoned us in fear and left us out to die. My stomach recoiled as I heard the words, for I couldn't deny the accusation. However, the human Space Marshal had a voice hammered in steel, and the captain of my ship ordered our immediate departure from the Sol system, leaving behind a message relay system to continue listening. However, the aging human said, his lips twitching into a grimace, there is something you never understood about us. A lesson that might have saved you, saved us, saved all this bloodshed. Humanity has never been prepared to die quietly, and if we're going to die, then we plan to take as many of you buzzers with us as we can. While the Saltash Council argued over what it meant, and ships blasted solward to kill the source of the transmission, an FTL pulse swept over the assembled fleet, and panic set in as stellar cartography teams registered a sudden massive change in the behaviour of the Central Star. My ship was one of only 3 to escape, and none of the Saltash fleet ships did, as within minutes the star began to expand. It takes time for a fleet to leave a solar system, and the sudden change in the star disrupted the interstellar drives that every sentient species used. I shall go to my grave with the screams of the Saltash in my ears. In all of galactic history, no species had been willing to detonate its own star as a final act of defiance. It was unheard of, but perhaps humanity understood the Saltash better than anyone knew. Understood that the ruling council would demand to be there at their moment of triumph, that they could be lured to a funeral pyre of their own making and trapped in it. Nothing remains of the Sol system now, or of the Saltash. The war went on too long. Their navy was spent, their people hammered into poverty by the unceasing, grinding cost of the war. Entire planets have been strip-mined, entire populations put in uniform, and thrown against an enemy who couldn't win, but who would die well at losing. The Sol system is a monument to hubris. The Saltash, a forgotten empire, absorbed by many of its neighbours over the next few decades, and a single message boy sits on the edge of where humanity once stood against the largest empire in the galaxy, and simply said no. It repeats its message, every quarter Christek, for as long as it can be maintained, as a warning and a prophecy. Beware humanity. There is no losing if you go down swinging.